Hi guys, so in this video I want to cover a relatively simple idea, that your improvisation should reflect your chord progression. So if, for example, your chord progression builds and creates tension, then your improvisation should build and create tension as well. If your chord progression resolves tension, then your improvisation should also resolve tension. If your chord progression modulates to a new key, then your improvisation should also modulate to a new key. And if your chord progression uses chromaticism, then your improvisation should also use chromaticism. This is one of the reasons why it's important to learn how to analyze a chord progression, because the chord progression informs your improvisation. Now, I have numerous videos that show you how to analyze a chord progression, so I'm not going to go over that again in detail here. But one of the things that I do explain in my How to Analyze a Chord Progression video is that there are 4 ways to use chords from a different key without changing key. That is, there are 4 ways to use foreign non-diatonic chords without modulating to another key. Now, these are chord substitutions, secondary dominants, borrowed chords, and passing chords. And I have a separate video on each one of those if you don't know what they are. So when we change key, we call this modulation. But when we use one of these 4 techniques, we can call this chromaticism. That is, we're inserting chromatic notes outside of the diatonic scale without actually changing key. So when you're improvising over a chord progression and that chord progression changes key, then typically your improvisation should also change key with your chord progression. But if your chord progression uses one of these 4 techniques and uses a foreign chord from a different key and creates a bit of chromaticism without truly modulating to a new key, then you can do one of 3 things with your improvisation. 1, you can change keys in your improvisation, though I wouldn't recommend doing this. 2, you can not change key and simply play over the top or straight through any foreign chords in the chord progression with your existing scale. So in a sense, you can just ignore the fact that there are non-diatonic chords in your chord progression and just keep playing with your original major scale. Or 3, you can not change key, but modify your existing scale to take account of the guide tones of the foreign chord. Now, this requires us to create a synthetic scale, and I'll explain all this in a bit more detail in a moment. So as our example, let's take the following chord progression. We'll start on E minor 7, going to A7, to D minor 7, then to D flat 7, to C major 7, then to F minor 7, to B flat 7, and ending on C major 7 again. Now, this chord progression is all in the key of C major. However, it does use some chromaticism. The A7 is a secondary dominant tonicizing the D minor 7. The D flat 7 is a tritone substitution of a G7. And the F minor 7 going to B flat 7 are a minor 4 to a flat 7 dominant chord borrowed from the Aeolian mode, or the natural minor. So, as I've already said, to improvise over this chord progression, you could do one of 3 things, and let's go over them in detail. So firstly, you could change keys. So over the E minor 7, play the C major scale, and over the A7, play the D major scale. Over the D minor 7, play the C major scale, and over the D flat 7, play the G flat major scale. Over the C major 7, play the C major scale. Over the F minor 7 and B flat 7, play the C natural minor scale. And finally ending on that C major 7 with the C major scale again. Now, I would not recommend this approach because your improvisation doesn't reflect your chord progression. it's kind of ignoring the fact that the chord progression hasn't modulated, it hasn't changed keys. Now, of course, it is perfectly fine to play this way and for your improvisation to change key even though your chord progression hasn't, but I feel like you're kind of missing an opportunity. Your improvisation and your chord progression kind of feel a bit disconnected. So again, you can do this, but I personally wouldn't recommend it. Now next, you could just play over the top of all the foreign chords with your existing scale. So we could play the C major scale over that entire chord progression and just completely disregard the fact that we've got some non-diatonic chords or chords from different keys in this chord progression. So just completely forget about any chromaticism in the chord progression and just keep plowing ahead with your C major scale right until the end. Now this is an okay approach to take. You are going to hit some unpleasant avoid notes, but that's okay. At least your solo is reflecting the chord progression by not changing key. And the final approach is that you can modify your scale to account for the guide tones of the foreign chord. So going through our chord progression, on the E minor 7, we would use just the C major scale. On the A7 chord, we want to change our C major scale to reflect the guide tones of this foreign chord. Now, the guide tones are the 3rd and the 7th of the chord, and in this case we have a C sharp and a G. So G is already in the C major scale, so that's fine, but C sharp is not. So instead of just playing the regular C major scale, we can play the C major scale, but play a C sharp instead of a C. Right, and now moving forward, the D minor 7, we just use the C major scale again, and the D flat 7, the guide tones of this chord, the 3rd and the 7th, are F and B. So both those notes are already in the C major scale, so we can continue just using the plain old C major scale to improvise over this chord. Then we get to the C major 7, so we keep using the C major scale. Then we get to the chord F minor 7. Now the guide tones of this chord are A flat and E flat. So we can play a C major scale, but replace the note A with A flat, and replace the note E with E flat. So instead of the C major scale, you have the C major scale with an E flat and an A flat. Then moving on to B flat 7, we see that the guide tones of this chord are D and A flat. So D is already in the key of C major, but A flat is not. So we can play the C major scale, but replace the note A for A flat. So again, over this chord, instead of playing the C major scale, we would play the C major scale, but with an A flat. And then the final chord is C major 7, so we go back to our C major scale. Now, I would recommend that you use this approach because you're not changing key, but you are using some outside notes or some chromaticism. So your improvisation perfectly reflects the chord progression. So while any of the above 3 approaches can work, the last one is recommended because it keeps most faithfully to what's actually happening in the chord progression. So the progression doesn't change key here, instead it simply uses chromaticism to make the harmony a bit more interesting. So as such, we should not change key in our improvisation. Instead, we should similarly use some chromaticism to mirror and adhere to what's already happening in the harmony. And because the guide tones are the most important notes in a chord, the scale which we use to improvise over them should reflect this and not clash with the underlying harmony. So I have a separate video where I explain why you can use a particular scale over a particular chord, which you can go and watch if you're interested. But in short, it's that you can use a particular scale over a particular chord if that scale contains the third and the seventh of the chord. And these are called, again, the guide tones. And they're the most important notes in the chord because they determine the quality of the chord, whether it's a major 7, a minor 7, or a dominant 7 chord. And so these new scales that we're creating by modifying notes in the major scale are called synthetic scales. So a synthetic scale is really just a regular diatonic scale, like the major scale, but with one or two notes altered by a semitone, so either flattened or sharpened, which is exactly what we've done here. So use synthetic scales over foreign chords in a progression. That way, the chromaticism in your solo reflects the chromaticism in the chord progression without needing to change key. Having said that, option 2 is also acceptable. We can just play straight through all of these chords and ignore all the chromaticism with our C major scale. And of course, some of the notes will clash with these foreign chords, but that's okay. You can treat them as avoid notes or as notes that build tension, which you can then resolve. But a good general rule to follow is that when the harmony changes key, your improvisation should change key. And when the harmony uses chromaticism, your improvisation should use chromaticism by using these synthetic scales. Cool, so I hope that helped and was interesting, and yeah, thanks for watching. See you guys.